Richard Coleman had always considered himself careful, not paranoid, but careful. He was 61 years old, 2 years away from retirement, and he had spent most of his adult life doing something many people struggled to do consistently, protecting what he had built. For nearly 4 decades, Richard followed a simple routine. He worked, he saved, he avoided unnecessary risks. He was not a gambler. He didn't chase hot stocks. He didn't day trade. Most of his retirement savings sat in a traditional IRA and a brokerage account he had slowly built over the years. Nothing flashy, just steady contributions, modest growth, and patience. The total wasn't extraordinary by Wall Street standards, but to Richard, it represented something far more personal. 37 years of early mornings, 37 years of commuting through traffic, 37 years of saying, maybe next year, to vacations that felt too expensive. $620,000. That number was not just money, it was time. Time he believed he had carefully secured for the future, and that future was finally starting to feel close. Richard had already begun imagining what retirement might look like. Nothing extravagant. He and his wife, Linda, had talked about driving across the country once he stopped working. Visiting small towns. Seeing national parks they had always postponed. They talked about slower mornings. Coffee on the porch instead of coffee in a travel mug during rush hour. The plan felt realistic, achievable, which is why the phone call that arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon did not feel like danger. It felt like responsibility. Richard was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing a utility bill when his phone rang. The caller ID displayed something that immediately caught his attention. Bank Fraud Department. He frowned slightly. Richard rarely received calls from unknown numbers, but the label looked legitimate. In fact, it looked reassuring. If something was wrong with his account, he wanted to know immediately. He answered. Hello? The voice on the other end sounded calm. Professional. Good afternoon. May I speak with Richard Coleman? This is Richard. Mr. Coleman, my name is Daniel Brooks. I'm calling from the Fraud Prevention Department at your bank. Richard straightened slightly in his chair. Okay, he said cautiously. Daniel Brooks continued in the same steady tone. Sir, we've detected a suspicious access attempt related to your online banking profile. Before we proceed, I need to confirm I'm speaking with the correct account holder. Richard felt a small tightening in his chest. Suspicious access attempt. Those words carry a certain weight when you're responsible for protecting your retirement savings. What kind of access attempt? Richard asked. I'll explain in just a moment, Daniel Brooks replied. But first, I need to verify a couple of details for security purposes. Richard hesitated. For years he had heard the warnings. Don't give personal information over the phone. Don't trust unexpected calls, but the caller did not sound rushed. He did not sound aggressive. If anything, he sounded patient, professional. And then Daniel Brooks said something that lowered Richard's guard. Mr. Coleman, for your protection, I won't ask for your full account number. I just need to confirm the last 4 digits. Richard blinked. That sounded responsible, cautious. What are the last 4 digits you have on file? Richard asked carefully. Daniel Brooks answered immediately. 3842. Richard felt the tension in his shoulders ease. Those were correct, which meant this man clearly had legitimate access to bank records. At least that was what Richard assumed. Okay, Richard said slowly. Yes, that's correct. Daniel Brooks continued. Thank you. And for additional verification, could you confirm your current mailing zip code? Richard gave it without hesitation. Everything still felt routine. Daniel Brooks paused for a moment, as if typing notes. Then he spoke again. Mr. Coleman, earlier today, our system flagged an attempted login to your online banking account from an unfamiliar device. Richard felt the tension return. What kind of device? He asked. It appears to be a desktop computer located outside your usual geographic area. Outside where? Richard asked. Daniel Brooks paused again. Then he said something that made Richard's stomach tighten. Outside the United States. For a moment, Richard didn't speak. He pictured someone, somewhere across the world, staring at a screen and trying to access the money he had spent decades saving. How is that possible? Richard finally asked. It happens more often than people realize, Daniel Brooks said calmly. That's why our fraud detection systems monitor login behavior very closely. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair. Did they get in? He asked. Not yet, Daniel Brooks replied. The answer brought a small wave of relief, but only briefly. However, Daniel Brooks continued, The attempt was persistent enough that our system flagged it as a potential coordinated access attempt. Richard frowned. What does that mean? It means someone may have obtained partial information related to your account, Daniel Brooks said. Richard felt the room grow very quiet. Partial information? Yes, sir. And because of that, we want to secure the account before any successful access occurs. The phrase sounded logical. Secure the account. Protect the funds. Richard appreciated the fact that the bank seemed to be taking the situation seriously. What do I need to do? He asked. Daniel Brooks answered without hesitation. Right now, the most important thing is confirming that you still have full control of your login credentials. Richard nodded instinctively, even though the caller could not see him. Of course. We'll go through a short verification process, Daniel Brooks said. After that, we can lock down the suspicious activity and prevent any unauthorized transfers. Richard exhaled slowly. That sounded reasonable. Necessary, even. Okay, he said. Daniel Brooks' voice remained calm, controlled, professional. Thank you, Mr. Coleman. I appreciate your cooperation. Situations like this are stressful, but the sooner we secure the account, the safer your funds will be. Richard looked at the notepad on the table in front of him, without realizing it. He had started writing down the name the caller gave earlier, Daniel Brooks. He underlined it once, not because he suspected anything, but because the conversation felt important, serious. Protecting $620,000 usually is. Richard adjusted his glasses and brought the phone closer to his ear. All right, he said. What's the next step? There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, just long enough for Richard to hear faint keyboard clicks. Then Daniel Brooks spoke again. First, I'm going to send a security verification code to your phone. When it arrives, please read it to me so I can confirm the account is still under your control. Richard nodded again. Okay. He waited. A few seconds later, his phone vibrated. A new message appeared on the screen, a 6-digit number. At that moment, Richard Coleman believed he was protecting his retirement. He did not realize he had just taken the first step toward losing it. Richard Coleman stared at the 6-digit code on his phone screen. For a moment, he hesitated, not because he suspected anything, but because something about reading security codes aloud had always made him slightly uncomfortable. He had seen the warnings before. Never share verification codes. Never give them to anyone. But the situation felt different. This wasn't a random caller asking for information. This was someone from the bank's fraud department. Someone who had already confirmed the last 4 digits of his account. Someone who clearly knew who he was. And more importantly, someone who was trying to stop a potential theft. Richard glanced back at the message. The text read, "Your verification code is 491826. Do not share this code with anyone." He paused briefly at the last sentence. Do not share with anyone. Technically, he was sharing it, but it was with the bank. At least that was what he believed. Did you receive the code, Mr. Coleman? Daniel Brooks asked calmly. Yes, Richard replied. Please read it when you're ready. Richard took a breath. 491826. There was a short pause, then the faint sound of typing again. Thank you, Daniel Brooks said. Verification confirmed. Richard felt a small sense of progress, like a problem was being actively managed. What happens now? He asked. Well, Daniel Brooks said, the good news is that the suspicious login attempt has not yet resulted in a successful transaction. That's good, Richard said quickly. Yes, sir, Daniel Brooks continued. However, our system shows that whoever attempted access may still be monitoring the account. Richard frowned. What do you mean monitoring? It means they may attempt additional login attempts, Daniel Brooks explained. Sometimes these attacks happen in waves. Richard didn't like the sound of that. So what do we do? He asked. Daniel Brooks' tone remained steady. The safest approach is to temporarily secure the funds until we fully verify that your login credentials haven't been compromised. Richard leaned forward slightly. Secure the funds how? By placing them in a protected holding environment within our internal system, Daniel Brooks said. The explanation sounded technical, but logical. Richard imagined something like a digital safe, a temporary lock, something banks probably did all the time during fraud investigations. Is that necessary? Richard asked. In cases involving attempted international access, yes, Daniel Brooks replied. It prevents unauthorized withdrawals while we reset your credentials. Richard slowly nodded to himself. That seemed reasonable. He had heard about hackers draining accounts before. He was relieved his bank had caught the attempt early. What do I need to do? He asked. Daniel Brooks answered immediately. I'm going to escalate this case to one of our senior security supervisors. He will guide you through the next step to secure the funds. Richard felt reassured by the word supervisor. It meant oversight, more protection. Okay, he said. Before I transfer the call, Daniel Brooks continued, I want to confirm something important. What's that? Are you currently near a computer or tablet where you can access your online banking? Richard looked toward the living room, where his laptop sat on the desk. Yes, he said. That will make the process faster, Daniel Brooks replied. The supervisor may ask you to log in so we can verify no unauthorized changes have been made. Richard stood from the kitchen table and walked slowly toward the laptop. All right, he said. I can do that. Excellent, Daniel Brooks replied. There was a short pause. Then he added something that seemed almost reassuring. Mr. Coleman, I know situations like this can be stressful, but you did the right thing by answering the call. Catching these attempts early makes a big difference. Richard appreciated that. It felt like confirmation that he was handling the situation correctly. Thank you, Richard said. I'm going to bring our security supervisor onto the line now, Daniel Brooks continued. A few seconds passed. Then another voice joined the call. Deeper, confident. Mr. Coleman, this is Andrew Keller from the Bank Security Division. Richard sat down at the desk in front of his laptop. Hello, I've reviewed the notes Daniel Brooks provided, Andrew Keller said. You may be experiencing an active account compromise attempt. Richard's stomach tightened again. But we're going to secure everything before that happens, Andrew Keller added quickly. That's good to hear, Richard said. First, Andrew Keller continued, I need to verify that you are the only person currently accessing your online banking. I am, Richard replied. Perfect. Please open your browser and go to your bank's website. Richard began typing the address he had used hundreds of times before. His login page appeared on the screen. I'm there, he said. Do not sign in yet, Andrew Keller said. Richard paused. Okay. Because the suspicious activity may still be connected to your login credentials, Andrew Keller explained, we will guide you through a secure verification step first. Richard nodded again, even though the caller couldn't see him. What does that involve? He asked. You'll receive a secure authentication link from our system, Andrew Keller said. It allows us to confirm that your device is the legitimate account holder. Richard had never heard of that process before, but then again, he had never dealt with a fraud investigation either. All right, he said. Once you open the link, Andrew Keller continued, you'll log in through our protected verification portal. Richard waited. A few seconds later, his phone vibrated again. A new text message appeared. It contained a link. At the top of the message were the words, Bank Security Verification. Richard stared at it for a moment. Everything so far had felt structured, organized, professional. 2 bank employees, security verification, protection procedures. It all sounded exactly like what a bank should do. What do you see, Mr. Coleman? Andrew Keller asked. I see the link, Richard said. Good, Andrew Keller replied calmly. Please open it. Richard tapped the screen. The page loaded almost instantly. It looked exactly like his bank's website. Same logo, same colors, same login fields. If there were differences, Richard couldn't see them. I'm on the page, he said. Perfect, Andrew Keller replied. Go ahead and sign in. Richard placed his hands on the keyboard. He typed his username, then his password, and pressed enter. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the page refreshed. All right, Richard said. I'm logged in. There was a pause on the phone. Then Andrew Keller spoke again. Thank you, Mr. Coleman. We're now verifying the account integrity. Richard leaned back slightly in the chair. For the first time since the call started, he felt a little calmer. The bank seemed to have everything under control. What Richard Coleman did not realize was that at that exact moment, someone else, somewhere far away, was logging into the real account using the information he had just entered. And the first transfer request had already been prepared. Richard Coleman stared at the laptop screen in front of him. The familiar dashboard of his online banking account had appeared after he entered his username and password. Everything looked normal. Account balance, recent transactions, savings, investments. All the numbers were exactly where they should be. For a moment, Richard felt reassured. Nothing appeared out of place. All right, Mr. Coleman, Andrew Keller said calmly over the phone. I'm reviewing the account activity now. Richard leaned back slightly in the chair. Do you see anything unusual? He asked. There was a brief pause on the line. Then the faint sound of typing again. Not yet, Andrew Keller replied. But that doesn't mean the attempt has stopped. Richard nodded slowly. The idea that someone might still be trying to access his account made him uneasy. "So what happens next?" he asked. "Our priority is to isolate the account from any potential external access," Andrew Keller explained. "To do that, we temporarily move the funds into a protected internal channel." Richard frowned slightly. "Move the funds?" "Yes, sir," Andrew Keller said. "It's a standard fraud prevention procedure." Richard had never heard of that process before, but he also had never dealt with a fraud alert. "What does that involve?" he asked. "Essentially, we create a temporary protected ledger entry while we reset your login credentials," Andrew Keller said. "Your funds remain fully under the bank's control." Richard looked again at the number displayed on his screen. $620,000. Seeing that number had always made him feel secure. Now it made him feel vulnerable. "That sounds fine," Richard said, "as long as everything stays safe." "Absolutely," Andrew Keller replied. Another pause followed. More keyboard clicks. Then Andrew Keller spoke again. "Mr. Coleman, I need to confirm something. Are you currently viewing your primary checking account?" Richard glanced at the screen. "Yes." "Good," Andrew Keller said. "In the next moment, you may see a small authorization transaction appear. This allows our system to verify transfer permissions." Richard raised an eyebrow. "How small?" "Usually less than $50, Andrew Keller said. "That's fine," Richard replied. He continued staring at the screen. A few seconds passed. Nothing happened. Richard shifted slightly in the chair. "Sometimes the system takes a minute," Andrew Keller said calmly. Richard waited. Then suddenly the page refreshed. A new transaction appeared. Authorization transfer. Pending. $49.17. Richard felt a small wave of relief. "That must be it," he said. "Yes," Andrew Keller confirmed. "That's the verification step." Richard relaxed a little more. Everything still looked legitimate, professional, methodical. The bank clearly knew what it was doing. What Richard could not see was what had happened seconds earlier on another computer. The login credentials he entered into the fake verification page had already been captured. At that exact moment, someone else had logged into the real banking portal using Richard's information. The small $49.17 transaction had not come from the bank. It came from the attackers. A test, a confirmation that the account was fully under their control. "Everything looks good on our end," Andrew Keller said. Richard nodded. "So the account is secure now?" "Almost," Andrew Keller replied. Richard waited. "There is one more step," Andrew Keller continued. "Because the attempted access originated from outside the country, we need to temporarily route large balances through a secured holding channel." Richard frowned again. "I'm not sure I understand." "It's essentially a quarantine for the funds," Andrew Keller said. "It prevents unauthorized withdrawals while we complete the security reset." Richard stared at the screen again. $620,000. Years of work, years of discipline. "All of it moves?" he asked. "Only temporarily," Andrew Keller said quickly. "Once the investigation is complete, the funds return automatically." Richard considered that. It sounded complicated, but banks were complicated institutions. Fraud prevention probably involved procedures customers never saw. "All right," Richard said slowly. "Good," Andrew Keller replied. "You're helping us prevent a serious theft." Richard felt a strange sense of responsibility, like he was actively protecting his retirement. "I'm glad we caught it early," he said. "So are we," Andrew Keller replied. Another few seconds passed. Then the page refreshed again. Richard noticed something new. A pending transaction. His eyes narrowed. Transfer request. Pending. $75,000. Richard leaned closer to the screen. "Hold on," he said. "Yes," Andrew Keller replied. "I see something here," Richard said. "What does it show?" Richard read it carefully. $75,000. Pending transfer. "Yes," Andrew Keller said immediately. "That's part of the protective routing." Richard felt uneasy for a moment. It was a large number, but if it was part of the security process, that made sense. "Will it show multiple transactions?" Richard asked. "Yes," Andrew Keller replied. "Large balances are sometimes segmented for security." Segmented. Another technical term. Another explanation that sounded plausible. Richard nodded slowly. "Okay." A few seconds later, the page refreshed again. Another pending transfer appeared. Transfer request. Pending. $120,000. Richard felt his pulse quicken slightly. "Another one just appeared," he said. "That's normal?" Andrew Keller replied calmly. Richard watched the screen. Another refresh. Another transaction. $200,000. Then another. $150,000. Richard swallowed. Seeing the numbers move felt strange, unsettling. But Andrew Keller's voice remained calm, controlled, confident. "It may take several minutes for the system to finish routing the funds," he said. Richard stared at the growing list of pending transfers. He tried to remind himself that this was temporary. Protection, security, fraud prevention. That was what the bank had said. And right now, Richard Coleman believed he was watching his money being secured. In reality, he was watching it disappear. Richard Coleman kept his eyes fixed on the laptop screen. The list of pending transactions had grown longer. Each line looked similar. Each one carried a large number: 75,000, 120,000, 200,000, 150,000. All marked the same way: pending. Richard felt a quiet discomfort in his chest. It wasn't panic, not yet. But seeing large portions of his savings moving across the screen was unsettling. "Mr. Coleman," Andrew Keller said calmly, "the system is completing the security routing." Richard cleared his throat. "Is it supposed to move this much at once?" "Yes," Andrew Keller replied without hesitation. "When balances are large, the system separates them into multiple secured segments." Richard looked again at the transactions. Segments, that was the word Andrew Keller had used earlier. A technical explanation. Banks use technical explanations all the time. Still, something about the process felt strange. "I just want to make sure nothing is actually leaving the bank," Richard said carefully. Andrew Keller responded immediately. "Correct. These are internal protective transfers." Internal, protected, temporary. Those words helped calm Richard's concern, but only slightly. He leaned closer to the screen. Another refresh. Another pending transfer appeared. $80,000. Richard rubbed his forehead. "How long does this usually take?" he asked. "A few minutes," Andrew Keller said. "Sometimes a little longer, depending on the account structure." Richard nodded slowly. He tried to remind himself that the bank had detected the suspicious access attempt first. They were the ones protecting him. They were the ones preventing a theft. At least, that was what he believed. What Richard could not see was the second screen open somewhere else in the world. On that screen, someone was logged into the real version of Richard's banking account. The attacker moved quickly. Each transfer request was carefully structured. Not too large, not too small. Amounts designed to avoid triggering automatic fraud blocks. $75,000, $120,000, $200,000. The attacker submitted them one after another. Meanwhile, Richard Coleman remained on the phone, distracted, guided, reassured. "Mr. Coleman," Andrew Keller said, "while the system processes the transfers, I'm going to reset your authentication credentials." "That sounds good," Richard said. "It will prevent any additional login attempts from unauthorized devices." Richard appreciated that. Security mattered more than convenience. "I'm glad you caught this," he said quietly. "So are we," Andrew Keller replied. Richard continued watching the screen. One of the earlier transfers changed status. Pending, then processing. Richard noticed immediately. "Something just updated," he said. "That's expected," Andrew Keller replied calmly. "It means the system is locking the funds into the protection channel." Richard exhaled slowly. Processing sounded official. Structured, controlled. Another refresh. Another transfer moved from pending to processing. Then another. Richard leaned back in the chair. "So, once this finishes, everything just moves back automatically?" he asked. "Yes," Andrew Keller said. "Once the security reset is complete, the funds are released back to your primary accounts." Richard nodded again. The explanation still sounded logical, but a small voice in the back of his mind began whispering something uncomfortable. Why had he never heard of this process before? He had banked with the same institution for more than 20 years. Fraud alerts, password resets, security questions, those he understood. But moving the entire balance into segments? That felt new. He almost asked the question. Almost. But Andrew Keller spoke again before he could. "Mr. Coleman, I need to confirm something quickly." "Sure," Richard replied. "Did you receive another verification message on your phone?" Richard looked down at the device beside the laptop. A new message had arrived, another 6-digit code. "Yes," Richard said. "Please read that code to me so I can finalize the credential reset," Andrew Keller said. Richard hesitated again, just for a second. The message once again included the familiar warning: "Do not share this code with anyone." He stared at those words, but Andrew Keller had already explained the process. Security verification, credential reset, fraud prevention. It all seemed connected. Richard read the code. 725409. "Thank you," Andrew Keller said. More typing sounds. Then silence for several seconds. Richard returned his attention to the laptop screen. Another transaction changed status. Processing. Another one. Processing. His pulse quickened slightly. Seeing the numbers move made the situation feel more real. Almost finished, Andrew Keller said calmly. Richard nodded. He had no idea that at that exact moment, the attackers had already begun sending the first completed transfer out of the banking system. From there, the money would move quickly. First to an intermediary account, then to an international exchange, then into cryptocurrency wallets. Once that happened, recovery would become almost impossible. But Richard didn't know any of that. He was still sitting at his desk, still on the phone, still believing that the bank was protecting him. And on the laptop screen in front of him, another transfer changed status from processing to completed. Richard Coleman noticed the change immediately. The first transaction on the screen no longer said processing. It now said something else. Completed. He leaned forward in the chair. Hold on, Richard said. Yes, Mr. Coleman? Andrew Keller replied calmly. One of the transfers says completed. There was a brief pause on the line. Then the steady voice returned. That's expected, Andrew Keller said. It means the funds have entered the protected holding channel. Richard stared at the number beside the transaction. $75,000. Completed. Seeing the word made him uneasy. Up until that moment, everything had felt temporary. Pending. Processing. Those words suggested movement inside a system. But completed sounded final. You're sure that's normal? Richard asked. Yes, Andrew Keller said immediately. The system finalizes each segment before moving the next. Richard nodded slowly. The explanation sounded reasonable, but the feeling in his stomach did not completely go away. Another line on the screen changed. Processing. Then a moment later, completed. $120,000. Richard shifted in his chair. Two large portions of his savings now carried that same word. Completed. How many of these segments are there? Richard asked. Just a few more, Andrew Keller said. The system is almost finished. Richard rubbed his hands together. He reminded himself of the situation. Someone had tried to access his account from outside the country. The bank had detected the attempt. They were securing the funds. That was the story. And up to this point, nothing had clearly contradicted it. But watching his retirement savings move piece by piece still made him uneasy. Another refresh. Another line changed. $200,000. Completed. Richard swallowed. 3 transfers. Nearly $400,000. All marked completed. His eyes moved quickly across the screen. He suddenly realized something. Andrew, he said. Yes? I don't see the balance number anymore. What do you mean? The main balance at the top of the page, Richard said. It looks smaller. Another pause. Andrew Keller answered calmly. That's because the funds have moved into the protection channel. The dashboard only shows active account balances. Richard exhaled slowly. That explanation made sense. Technically, but something about the situation still felt strange. Richard had always believed moving money inside a bank would leave some kind of trace. A temporary holding account, a protected ledger, something visible. But the money simply appeared to be disappearing from his main account view. How long before it shows again? Richard asked. Once the security reset finishes, Andrew Keller said. Usually within 24 hours. 24 hours? That felt longer than Richard expected. But fraud investigations probably required time. Another refresh. Another transfer completed. $150,000. Richard watched the list carefully now. His entire account history was filling with large transfers, every one of them labeled completed. Just one more step, Andrew Keller said. Richard looked up slightly. What step? We need to finalize the device authentication, Andrew Keller replied. This confirms your computer is the authorized device for future access. That sounds fine, Richard said. You should receive another security message shortly. Richard glanced at his phone. A moment later, it vibrated again. Another text message. Another 6-digit code. Richard stared at it. The same warning appeared at the bottom. Do not share this code with anyone. He felt that small hesitation again. But Andrew Keller spoke before he could think too long about it. Please read the code when you're ready. Richard sighed quietly. Then he read the numbers. 386914. Thank you, Andrew Keller said. More typing. More quiet clicking sounds in the background. Richard turned his attention back to the screen. One final transfer changed status. Processing. Then, completed. The list was finished. Every segment now carried the same word. Completed. Richard leaned back in the chair. So that's it? He asked. Yes, Andrew Keller replied. The funds are now secure. Richard felt a wave of relief pass through him. The situation had been stressful, but it seemed under control now. "What happens next?" he asked. "We finish resetting your account credentials," Andrew Keller said. "Then the funds will automatically return to your primary balance once the system verifies the security lock." Richard nodded. That sounded like the final step. He had done everything the bank asked, verified his identity, confirmed the device, allowed the protective routing, everything. Richard had no idea that at that exact moment, the attackers had already moved the first completed transfer out of the bank entirely. The money was no longer inside any protected channel. It was already moving through a chain of accounts designed to make it disappear. Within minutes, the funds would be converted into cryptocurrency, and once that happened, Richard Coleman's $620,000 would be almost impossible to recover. But sitting at his desk, listening to the calm voice on the phone, Richard believed the danger had passed. He believed the bank had protected him. He believed his retirement savings were safe. And for the next few hours, he would continue believing that. When the call finally ended, Richard Coleman sat quietly in front of the laptop for a moment. The room felt strangely calm, almost too calm. Nearly 40 minutes had passed since the phone first rang. In that time, Richard had verified his identity multiple times, logged into his account, and watched several large transfers move through the system. But according to Andrew Keller, everything was now secure. The final words before the call ended had sounded reassuring. "Your funds are now protected, Mr. Coleman. The account credentials have been reset, and the system will automatically restore the balance once the security review is complete." Richard had thanked him. He had even written down the name again on the notepad. Andrew Keller, Security Division. Then the line disconnected. For a few seconds, Richard continued staring at the laptop screen. His transaction history was still visible. Every large transfer showed the same final status: completed. The main account balance at the top of the page looked smaller now, but Andrew Keller had already explained that. The money had moved into a protected channel. It would return after the security verification finished, probably tomorrow. Richard slowly closed the laptop. His shoulders relaxed for the first time since the phone call began. The situation had been stressful, but it seemed like the bank had handled it professionally. They had detected the suspicious login. They had acted quickly, and now the account was protected. At least that was what Richard believed. He stood up from the desk and walked back toward the kitchen. Linda was in the living room, watching television. "Everything okay?" she asked when she saw his expression. Richard nodded. "Yeah, the bank called it about a fraud alert." Linda muted the television. "Fraud? Someone tried to access the account from overseas," Richard said. Linda's eyes widened slightly. "Seriously?" "Yeah," Richard said, sitting down on the couch. "But they caught it before anything happened." Linda exhaled. "That's good." "They had to move the money temporarily while they reset the account security," Richard added. Linda frowned slightly. "Move the money where?" "Into some kind of protected system," Richard said. "Internal security thing." Linda thought about that for a moment. But banks were complicated institutions. Fraud protection probably involved procedures most customers never saw. "Well," she said, "I'm glad they caught it." "Me too," Richard replied. The conversation ended there. Neither of them thought much more about it. The rest of the evening felt normal. Dinner, television, a quiet walk around the block after sunset. Richard even felt a small sense of relief. If anything, the situation confirmed that the bank's fraud systems were working exactly as they should. Someone had tried to access his account. The bank detected it. They secured the funds. Problem solved. Later that night, Richard brushed his teeth and checked his phone one last time before bed. No new messages from the bank. No alerts. No warnings. Everything seemed quiet. He placed the phone on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. Within minutes, he was asleep. Across the world, however, the situation looked very different. The attackers who had accessed Richard's account were working quickly. The first completed transfers had already moved through several intermediary accounts. Those accounts existed for one purpose: to break the trace. Money that had once been clearly connected to Richard Coleman was now splitting into smaller streams. Each stream moved toward a different destination, some to international payment processors, some to overseas exchanges, and a large portion toward cryptocurrency wallets that would soon become impossible to track. By the time Richard Coleman woke up the next morning, most of his retirement savings would already be gone. But at that moment, lying in the quiet darkness of his bedroom, Richard had no idea. He believed the problem had been solved. He believed the bank had protected him, and he slept peacefully that night. Because sometimes the most dangerous scams don't end with panic. They end with reassurance. and the real damage doesn't become visible until the next day. Richard Coleman woke up a few minutes before his alarm. Morning light was just beginning to slip through the curtains. For a moment, he lay still in bed, thinking about the phone call from the day before, the fraud alert, the security process, the transfers. He remembered Andrew Keller's final words clearly. The funds will return to your primary balance once the security review is complete. Richard assumed the process might already be finished. Banks often ran system updates overnight. Curious more than worried, he reached for his phone on the nightstand. He opened his banking app. The familiar login screen appeared. For a moment he hesitated. Andrew Keller had said the credentials would be reset, but the app accepted his username and password without any issue. The dashboard began loading. Richard expected to see the same screen he had seen hundreds of times before. Checking account, savings, investment balance, $620,000. Instead, the numbers that appeared made no sense. Richard blinked. Then he leaned closer to the phone. At the top of the screen was his checking account balance, $1,842.63. He frowned slightly. That was normal. His checking account had never been the large one. But the investment account below it looked wrong. Very wrong. Richard tapped it. The page refreshed. For a moment, he assumed it was a loading issue. Maybe the system was still updating. The number appeared again, $2,109.18. Richard's eyes moved quickly across the screen. He refreshed the page again. Same number, $2,000. That couldn't be right. His IRA alone held more than $500,000. He sat up in bed now, completely awake. "Linda?" he said quietly. His wife turned slightly beside him. "What's wrong?" "Something's off with the bank account," Richard said. Linda pushed herself up on one elbow. "What do you mean?" "The balance looks wrong," he said. "How wrong?" Richard stared at the number again. "About 600,000 wrong." Linda sat up fully now. "What?" Richard refreshed the page again. Nothing changed. He opened the transaction history. The screen filled with entries from the previous afternoon. Transfer. Completed. $75,000 transfer. Completed. $120,000 transfer. Completed. $200,000 transfer. Completed. $150,000 transfer. Completed. $80,000. Richard's mouth went dry. Every transfer was marked the same way. Completed. Linda leaned closer to see the screen. "What are those?" she asked. Richard felt a cold wave move through his chest. "They're the transfers from yesterday," he said. "The security transfers?" "Yes." Linda frowned. "Why don't they show coming back?" Richard didn't answer, because suddenly he realized something. Andrew Keller had said the funds would return after the security review, but nothing on the screen suggested they were waiting anywhere inside the bank. The transfers didn't say internal. They didn't say protected. They didn't say pending. They simply said something else. External transfer. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. External. He opened one of the transaction details. Destination account. Unknown. Processing network. International. Richard's hands started shaking. "That's not right," he said quietly. "What?" Linda asked. Richard looked up at her slowly. "I think the money left the bank." Linda stared at him. "What do you mean left?" Richard felt his heart pounding now. "The account number's here. They're not ours." Linda's face changed instantly. "Call the bank," she said. Richard nodded. He grabbed his phone and searched for the bank's official customer service number, not the number that had called him yesterday. The real one. The one printed on the back of his debit card. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed. The call connected after a few seconds. "Thank you for calling customer support," the automated voice said. Richard felt his chest tighten as he waded through the menu options. Finally, a representative answered. "Good morning. Thank you for calling. How can I help you today?" Richard tried to steady his voice. "Yes, I need to speak with someone in the fraud department immediately." "Of course," the representative said. "May I ask what the issue is?" Richard looked again at the list of completed transfers. Nearly every dollar he had saved for retirement. Gone. "I think my account was compromised yesterday," he said. There was a short pause on the line. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir," the representative replied. "Did you notice unauthorized transactions?" Richard swallowed. "Yes," he said slowly. "Multiple large transfers." "Do you know approximately when they occurred?" the representative asked. Richard looked at the timestamps. "Yesterday afternoon." "Did anyone from the bank contact you regarding those transactions?" the representative asked. Richard hesitated. Then he answered, "Yes." There was a brief pause. "Can you tell me who contacted you?" she asked. Richard looked at the notepad still sitting on the desk downstairs. The name he had written. the name he had trusted. Daniel Brooks, Richard said, and a security supervisor named Andrew Keller. The line went silent for a moment. Then the representative spoke again. Her tone had changed. Sir, I'm going to transfer you directly to our fraud investigation team. Richard felt his stomach drop. Why? He asked quietly. Another pause. Then she said something that made the entire situation suddenly feel very different. Because those names are not associated with our bank. Richard's grip tightened on the phone. What do you mean? He asked. I mean, she said carefully, those are not employees here. Richard closed his eyes. And in that moment, he finally understood. The calls, the verification codes, the transfers, none of it had come from the bank. Richard Coleman sat at the kitchen table with his phone pressed tightly against his ear. The coffee in front of him had gone cold. Across the table, Linda watched his face carefully. She could already tell something was very wrong. On the other end of the line, a new voice had joined the call. Calm, professional, but noticeably more serious than the first representative. Mr. Coleman, the man said, my name is Stephen Harris. I'm part of the bank's fraud investigation team. Richard nodded slowly. Okay, I'm going to ask you a few questions so we can understand exactly what happened yesterday, Stephen Harris said. Richard swallowed. All right. Did you receive an unexpected phone call claiming to be from the bank's fraud department? Yes, Richard said. What time did that call occur? Richard thought for a moment. Early afternoon, around 2 o'clock. Did the caller ask you to verify your identity? Yes. How did they do that? Stephen Harris asked. They knew the last 4 digits of my account, Richard said. And they asked for my zip code. There was a pause on the line. Stephen Harris sighed quietly. That's a common technique, he said. Richard felt his chest tighten. What kind of technique? It's called social engineering, Stephen Harris explained. The attackers gather partial information about a customer and use it to build trust during the call. Richard glanced at Linda. Her expression had turned pale. They sounded legitimate, Richard said quietly. I understand, Stephen Harris replied. They're trained to sound legitimate. Richard looked down at the list of transfers on the laptop. His stomach twisted. They told me someone overseas was trying to access the account, he said. Yes, Stephen Harris said. That's another common tactic. Richard rubbed his forehead. They also had me read verification codes. Stephen Harris didn't speak for a moment. Then he asked carefully, did the text message say not to share the code? Richard closed his eyes briefly. Yes. Stephen Harris sighed again. Those codes allow someone to complete a login from another device, he explained. Richard felt a wave of nausea. So when I read the code, you authorized their login attempt? Stephen Harris said gently. Richard didn't respond. The room felt suddenly very quiet. After a few seconds, Stephen Harris continued. Did they ask you to open a link? Richard nodded. Yes. And log in? Yes. That website was almost certainly a fake version of the bank's login page, Stephen Harris said. Richard's hands began to shake again. So they got my password too? Yes, Stephen Harris said. Richard leaned back in the chair. The pieces were starting to connect now. The fake website, the verification codes, the calm voices. They kept me on the phone the whole time, Richard said. That's intentional? Stephen Harris replied. Why? So you don't have time to question what's happening, he said. Richard stared at the laptop screen again. Transfer after transfer. Completed. How much money is actually gone? Richard asked quietly. Stephen Harris paused. Then he answered carefully. Based on what I'm seeing here, approximately $618,000. Linda covered her mouth with her hand. Richard felt like the air had disappeared from the room. $618,000, nearly everything he had saved for retirement. Can you reverse it? Richard asked. There was a long silence. Finally, Stephen Harris spoke again. We're going to attempt to trace the transfers immediately. Richard waited. But I want to be honest with you, Stephen Harris continued. Once funds move through international intermediary accounts and cryptocurrency exchanges, recovery becomes extremely difficult. Richard felt his stomach sink. How difficult? In many cases, Stephen Harris said quietly, impossible. Richard stared at the table. He could hear Linda breathing beside him. Slow, shocked. But we will still open a full investigation, Stephen Harris added. We'll also file a report with federal authorities. Richard nodded slowly. Okay. Do you still have the phone numbers that contacted you? Stephen Harris asked. Yes, Richard said. Good. We'll need those. Richard reached for the notepad where he had written the names. Daniel Brooks, Andrew Keller. 2 names that had sounded so professional the day before. Stephen Harris spoke again. I know this is overwhelming, Mr. Coleman. But I need to ask one more question. Richard looked up slightly. All right. During the call yesterday, did the callers ask you to move the funds yourself? Richard shook his head slowly. No. They told me the system was moving them. Stephen Harris sighed quietly again. That's how they do it, he said. Richard frowned. What do you mean? They make you believe the bank is protecting the money, Stephen Harris explained. So you don't stop the transfers. Richard stared at the transaction list again. Every step now looked different. The verification codes, the fake login page, the segmented transfers. Each piece had been carefully designed, not to hack the bank, but to convince him to unlock the door himself. Richard Coleman had spent decades protecting his retirement savings, avoiding risky investments, saving consistently, planning carefully, but in less than an hour, a voice on the phone had convinced him to give everything away. And now the hardest part was beginning to settle in, because understanding what happened would not bring the money back. After the call ended, Richard Coleman didn't move. The phone was still in his hand. The kitchen felt strangely quiet, too quiet. Across the table, Linda sat frozen in her chair, staring at the laptop screen. Neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. The numbers were still there, transfer after transfer, each one a reminder of what had just happened. Finally, Linda broke the silence. $600,000, she said softly. Richard nodded once. His throat felt tight. 618. Linda leaned back in her chair slowly. That's our retirement. Richard didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew it. That money had taken nearly 35 years to save. Overtime shifts, careful budgeting, postponed vacations, driving older cars long after their friends had upgraded. Every decision had been made with the same goal in mind, security later in life. And now it was gone. Linda spoke again, her voice trembling slightly. How could the bank let that happen? Richard shook his head slowly. They didn't, he said. Linda frowned. What do you mean? Richard stared at the laptop screen. The man said it wasn't the bank, he replied. Linda's expression tightened. Then who was it? Richard swallowed. Scammers. The word hung in the air. Linda covered her face with both hands. Oh my God. Richard leaned forward and rubbed his forehead. I thought they were protecting the account, he said quietly. Linda lowered her hands and looked at him. What exactly did they say yesterday? Richard tried to remember every detail. They told me someone in Singapore was trying to log in, he said. Linda nodded slowly. And then? They said they needed to secure the funds before the hackers could move them. Linda's brow furrowed. So you moved the money? Richard shook his head. No, that's the thing. He pointed at the screen. They made it look like the bank's system was doing it. Linda stared at the transaction list again. But you approved it somehow. Richard nodded slowly. The verification codes. Linda's eyes widened. You gave them the codes? They said it was to confirm the security process, Richard replied. Linda exhaled slowly. Oh, Richard. There was no anger in her voice, only shock and sadness. Richard leaned back in his chair. They sounded completely real, he said. Linda didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked around the kitchen. The same kitchen where they had lived for nearly 20 years. The same table where they had planned their retirement. Travel, visiting their grandchildren more often. Maybe buying a small house near the coast someday. She looked back at Richard. What are we going to do? She asked quietly. Richard didn't have an answer. For the first time in decades, he truly didn't know. A few minutes later, Richard's phone buzzed. Both of them looked at it instantly. It was a notification from the bank. Richard opened the message. Fraud investigation case created. Below it was a case number and a short message. Our investigation team is reviewing the transactions associated with your account. Linda leaned closer. What does that mean? Richard read the rest of the message. They're trying to trace where the money went. Linda nodded slightly. That's good, right? Richard hesitated. The investigator said it might be impossible. Linda stared at the table. The reality of the situation was slowly becoming clearer. This wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't a temporary banking error. It wasn't a system glitch that would be fixed in a few hours. It was something else entirely. A crime. And the people who committed it were likely thousands of miles away, hidden behind fake phone numbers, fake websites, fake names. Richard looked at the phone again. Daniel Brooks, Andrew Keller, names that probably didn't exist. Linda spoke again. Did they say anything else yesterday? Richard nodded slowly. One thing. What? She asked. Richard stared at the wall for a moment before answering. They told me not to hang up the phone while the security process was running. Linda frowned. Why? Richard sighed. Because if I had hung up, I probably would have called the bank directly. Linda nodded slowly, and suddenly the entire plan made perfect sense. The urgency, the professionalism, the constant reassurance. It had all been designed to control one thing: time. because the longer Richard stayed on the phone, the less chance he had to realize what was really happening. Linda looked at him again. "We need to report this to the police," she said. Richard nodded. The bank said federal investigators would probably get involved. Linda exhaled slowly. Then she asked the question Richard had been trying not to think about. "If they can't recover the money, what happens to us?" Richard didn't answer right away, because the truth was something he hadn't fully processed yet. Their retirement savings were gone, and unless something extraordinary happened, they might never see it again. 2 days later, Richard Coleman received another call from the bank's fraud investigation team. This time, the voice on the phone sounded even more serious. "Mr. Coleman, this is Stephen Harris again," the investigator said. Richard stepped outside onto the back porch so Linda wouldn't have to hear the conversation again. "Do you have any updates?" Richard asked. There was a short pause on the line. "Yes," Stephen Harris replied. Richard gripped the phone a little tighter. "And? We were able to trace the initial transfers," Harris said. Richard felt a small spark of hope. "Where did they go?" "Several intermediary accounts," Harris explained. "What does that mean?" "It means the money didn't stay in one place," Harris said. "It moved quickly through multiple accounts within minutes." Richard frowned. "Why would they do that?" "To make it harder to trace," Harris replied. Richard leaned against the porch railing. "How many accounts are we talking about?" "Right now we've identified at least 12. Richard's eyes widened. "12? "Yes," Harris said. "And that's just the first layer." Richard stared out at the quiet backyard. "So where is it now?" Harris hesitated. "That's the problem," he said. Richard waited. "Within about 30 minutes of the transfers leaving your account," Harris continued, "most of the funds were converted into cryptocurrency." Richard had heard the word before, but he didn't fully understand it. "You mean like Bitcoin?" he asked. "Yes," Harris replied. Richard felt his stomach drop again. "So it's gone?" "Not necessarily," Harris said carefully. "But cryptocurrency transactions move through decentralized networks." "What does that mean?" "It means there's no central bank controlling them," Harris explained. Richard rubbed his forehead. "Which means you can't reverse it." Harris didn't answer immediately. "That's correct." Richard exhaled slowly. "So who's investigating this now?" "The case has been forwarded to federal authorities," Harris said. Richard nodded. "You mean the FBI?" "Yes." Richard looked out across the yard again. A neighbor was mowing his lawn. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Everything looked completely normal. Yet his entire financial future had changed in less than 24 hours. "What are the chances of getting the money back?" Richard asked quietly. Harris answered honestly. "I want to be transparent with you, Mr. Coleman." Richard braced himself. "In cases like this, recovery rates are very low." "How low?" "Less than 10%. Richard closed his eyes. 10%. That meant 90% of victims never recovered their money. Harris continued. "These criminal groups operate internationally. Many of them are based overseas, beyond U.S. jurisdiction." Richard spoke again. "How many people do this?" Harris gave a surprising answer. "Entire organizations." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" "These operations often involve dozens of people," Harris explained. "Callers, technical teams, money mules, cryptocurrency brokers." Richard felt a chill. "So the people who called me may not even know where the money ultimately goes," Harris said. Richard thought back to the voices he had trusted. Daniel Brooks, Andrew Keller, calm, professional, friendly. They had sounded like ordinary bank employees, but now he realized something unsettling. Those voices were probably just one small piece of a much larger machine. Harris spoke again. "There's something else you should know." Richard straightened slightly. "What?" "We reviewed the phone numbers used to contact you." "And?" "They were spoofed." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means the numbers were disguised to look like they were coming from the bank." Richard shook his head slowly. "So even if I looked it up, it would appear legitimate," Harris said. Richard remembered something suddenly. "The website they sent me," he said. "Yes?" "It looked exactly like the bank's login page." "That's called a phishing site," Harris replied. Richard sighed. "They really thought of everything." "Yes," Harris said. Then he added something that stuck with Richard long after the call ended. "These groups run thousands of scams every week." Richard felt a wave of disbelief. "Thousands?" "Yes. And unfortunately," Harris continued, "many of them work." Richard ended the call a few minutes later. When he walked back inside, Linda looked up immediately. "What did they say?" Richard sat down slowly. "They found where the money went." Linda leaned forward. "And?" Richard hesitated. Then he told her the truth. "It's probably halfway around the world by now." Linda stared at him. "And the FBI?" "They're investigating." Linda nodded slowly. "But both of them knew something now." Investigating a crime was very different from undoing it. Richard looked again at the laptop screen. The balance still read the same number, $2,000. And for the first time since the call 2 days earlier, the full weight of the situation finally settled in. The scammers hadn't just stolen money. They had stolen decades of security.